Beach, rock critic for Bloomberg News. So,
Yeah.
uh, you've written books, right? Because you have to write books in order to become a critic,
Yeah.
don't you?
Well, a lot of people do, and in my case, it's the first few books, apart from one book of poetry, were books about rock music, and particularly why bands were called what they were called, and that got to be a real obsession with me, and it's produced two big books. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, how did you come about a book of rock?
Well,
All right.
the first one, the A to Z of Names in Rock, came about after I'd interviewed Sting, and it was a question that I started asking at the end of every interview with a star: is why you called what you're called. I left it till the last question in case they got annoyed or upset. But the interview with Sting went very well. I've interviewed him a few times now, and at the end of the recording, he said, "Yeah, I'll tell you why. I'd heard various stories that he was named Sting after Death, Where Is Thy Sting? It could be something to do with Scott Joplin. And I'd also heard the story that it was something to do with a stripy jumper, a black and yellow stripy jumper he wore during his very early days. And I asked him the question, and he said, yeah, it was the jumper. It was in a jazz band up north in England, and someone called him Sting as a joke, and it stuck.
I've seen here that you have found out that ABBA originally was called Utne Singer.
Yeah, this is one of the things you find so many bands that now have familiar names, which we all know and love, but in their very early days, then they had not such good names. Aha, for example, were known as Spider Empire in their very early days. The Beatles started off going through a few names, such as Johnny and the Moondogs, which would never have been as so successful as the Beatles, but they managed to sort out a more sensible name in the end.
So who decides eventually to change the name?
It's
Is it a producer or they do it themselves? Or
it's usually a band decision, but sometimes it can be forced on them. There's someone like John Mellencamp who discovered to his shock that he'd been renamed Johnny Cougar in the very early days. The Beach Boys, who had a pretty bad name, they were called the Pendletones after a type of surfing shirt, were renamed by the record label, and it was only when they got the first pressing of their first single that they saw they were called the Beach Boys. They said, what? No, it's not our name. But it was too late. The record was pressed and the name stayed.
so can you give us one of the worst name of a band?
There are some really bad names, and usually the band names are the ones that are things which are just so albatross around the neck you would not do it. I mean, the Beach Boys actually probably is one because like they're obviously not boys anymore. They're men or whatever. But something like Gay Bikers on Acid or the Psychedelic Furs or people like that, then they're just such bizarre names that people didn't really concentrate on the music. They were going, what? What does the name mean? Where did it come from? And that's not a good thing. You do want to draw attention to yourself, but not too much.
Does it ever happen that the name was actually misleading the public, thinking that they were singing something else or whatever?
Yeah, very often, in fact, there are misconceptions in names, and people don't know really where they come from. And sometimes people do choose a name to be just misleading anyway, like, Bare Naked Ladies, which a group of guys who always keep their clothes on doesn't make any sense. But misleading names very often I found are things like, people think that a name like the Crickets or something like that, Buddy Holly's cohorts, how do they get that name? People thought that it was something to do with hearing noises in a room and all the rest of it. And the incidents are kind of genuine. They're metamorphosis from a group called the Cotton Club. And they were going into the studio when an insect got into one of the echo chambers and started making this noise. And they just said, hey, it's great, let's call ourselves the Crickets.
All right, okay. So tell us an amazing story that you've written, what you find out in your book.
Yeah. The one about the Crickets is probably quite amazing in its own sort of way because no one would really think of that as being quite as incredible as it was. But it's names that just came in a crazy way, like, Alice Cooper, for example, just couldn't think of a name. And he said that he was terrified by an Ouija board session and indicated that it was actually the reincarnation of a 17th century witch. There are reasons to actually doubt that that's how he produced the name, but it's still a great story.
So after these two books, I know there is another one coming up.
Yes, there certainly is. Yes, yes. So the A to Z book was followed by the Dictionary of Rock and Pop Names, which is still out there on Amazon. But the one that's coming out next will be called All You Need Is Rock, and it'll be a compilation of my columns and interviews over the last 10 years. So I'm looking forward to that greatly.
Okay, and when it's coming out, can we preview it? Can we tell our audience that?
Oh, indeed, yes, yes. It's got a lot of ins and outs. It's one of those books where during the years, then I've met or interviewed or reviewed people like Amy Winehouse and Michael Jackson. Sadly, are no longer with us, and they form the backbone of the book. But there are many other people I've met too, so it'll all be in there, and hopefully we can talk about it again.
Also, we are waiting for you again to come here to tell us all about it.
I look forward to it. Thanks very much, Massimo.
Thank you.